I still remember the way her hand felt on my chest that night, flat and steady, like she was trying to calm both of us at once. It didn't start there. It started months earlier, in a parking garage that smelled like oil and cold concrete. I was 38, divorced for just over a year, living alone in a one-bedroom apartment in downtown Boston. I worked as a senior operations manager for a tech consulting firm. On paper, my life looked stable. Good job. Clean apartment. Gym membership I barely used. My evenings were quiet in a way that felt louder than noise. Microwave dinners. Sports highlights. Laundry folded too neatly because there was nothing else to do. My ex had moved to Denver with someone she met at a conference. I found out through Instagram. After that, I stopped checking. Most days I went through the motions. I showed up early. Stayed late. Kept my head down. People described me as reliable. Steady. The kind of man you could count on. No one ever used the word exciting. I had stopped expecting that from myself. Susan became CEO 3 months before everything changed. She was 46. Sharp suits. Calm voice. The kind of presence that made board members sit up straighter. She had built 2 companies before ours and sold one for more money than I could imagine. She was married. I learned that from a company town hall where she thanked her husband for holding things together at home. She wore her ring every day. The first time I really noticed her, it wasn't attraction. It was the way she stood alone after a board meeting while 2 investors walked past her like she wasn't there. I was heading to my car that Tuesday evening when I heard one of them say, not even quietly, "She's good, but we need someone younger to drive this next phase." Fresh energy. Investors like that. The other man laughed. She had her run. They kept walking. Susan stayed still for a second. Just a second. Then she bent to pick up her folder like she hadn't heard a thing. But I saw her jaw tighten. I saw the way she inhaled, slow and careful. Something about that stayed with me. 2 days later it happened again, but worse. We were in a conference room on the 22nd floor. Glass walls. City skyline behind us. She had just finished presenting a growth plan that was clean, clear, and realistic. I'd helped build part of the operations model. It was solid. One of the newer board members, a guy in his early 30s with expensive sneakers, leaned back and said, "This feels safe. Maybe too safe. No offense, Susan, but the market's moving fast. We need aggressive vision. Not stability." He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked at the other men in the room. No offense. I felt something twist in my stomach. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't snap. She just nodded once and said, "Aggressive without foundation is just expensive chaos." It should have ended there. It didn't. He smirked. "Sure. I just think maybe the company needs a different kind of energy at the top." Different kind of energy. I watched the room. No one said anything. Not the CFO. Not legal. Just silence. The kind that agrees without speaking. I don't know what pushed me. Maybe it was the look on her face. Not anger. Not even embarrassment. Just something tired. Like she'd heard this before. I cleared my throat. It was small, that sound, but it felt loud in that room. "With respect," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "The last 2 quarters exceeded projections because of the systems she put in place. Safe doesn't usually produce that kind of margin." The room shifted. Heads turned toward me. The board member raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Daniel Harper. Operations." He gave a short nod, dismissive. "Right. Operations people love safe." A few quiet laughs. I should have stopped there. That would have been easier. Instead I said, "Operations people also clean up after aggressive ideas fail." The silence after that was different. Tighter. Susan didn't look at me right away. When she did, her expression was unreadable. The meeting moved on. Numbers. Charts. Action items. But something had shifted. Afterward I went back to my desk and immediately wondered if I had just damaged my career. An hour later, as I was packing up to leave, my phone buzzed. It was an internal message from Susan. "Do you have a minute?" My heart kicked in a way it hadn't in a long time. Her office was quieter than the rest of the floor. Lights dimmed. City glowing behind the glass. She had taken off her blazer. Sleeves rolled to her elbows. More human that way. She closed the door behind me. "You didn't have to do that," she said. I shrugged. It was accurate. A small smile touched her mouth. Not big. Just enough. "They weren't wrong," she said after a second. "The market does like younger." "That doesn't mean they're right," I replied. She studied me for a moment. Not like a boss assessing an employee. More like she was trying to place something. "Why speak up?" she asked. "Most people stay quiet." I didn't have a polished answer. "I don't like watching people get dismissed for the wrong reasons." She nodded slowly. "Still," she said softer now, "thank you." There was something in her voice that caught me off guard. Not gratitude exactly. Relief, maybe. I noticed then how tired she looked up close. A faint line between her brows. The weight of being the only woman at the table. The only one who had to prove she still belonged. She glanced at the framed photo on her desk. Her husband, I assumed. They were at some event. Smiling. Formal. "You know," she said quietly, almost to herself. "They never question the men about energy." I didn't know what to say to that. She straightened a stack of papers that didn't need straightening. A small, controlled movement. "I won't forget what you said in there," she added. "That matters." I left her office feeling unsettled. Not because I regretted it. Because something had shifted inside me. For the first time in a long while, my day hadn't felt like repetition. It felt like I'd chosen something. Like I'd stepped out of the quiet outline I'd been living in. That night, alone in my apartment, I kept replaying the look on her face when she thought no one was watching. The tight jaw in the parking garage. The way she held herself together in that conference room. I told myself it was professional respect. Nothing more. But when my phone buzzed again close to midnight with a short message from her, just 2 words. "Are you awake?" I stared at the screen longer than I should have. And I answered. That was the first boundary I crossed. I still remember the way her hand felt on my chest that night, flat and steady, like she was trying to calm both of us at once. It didn't start there. It started months earlier, in a parking garage that smelled like oil and cold concrete. I was 38, divorced for just over a year, living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in downtown Boston. I worked as a senior operations manager for a tech consulting firm. On paper, my life looked stable. Good job. Clean apartment. Gym membership I barely used. My evenings were quiet in a way that felt louder than noise. Microwave dinners. Sports highlights. Laundry folded too neatly because there was nothing else to do. My ex had moved to Denver with someone she met at a conference. I found out through Instagram. After that, I stopped checking. Most days I went through the motions. I showed up early. Stayed late. Kept my head down. People described me as reliable. Steady. The kind of man you could count on. No one ever used the word exciting. I had stopped expecting that from myself. Susan became CEO 3 months before everything changed. She was 46. Sharp suits. Calm voice. The kind of presence that made board members sit up straighter. She had built 2 companies before ours and sold one for more money than I could imagine. She was married. I learned that from a company town hall where she thanked her husband for holding things together at home. She wore her ring every day. The first time I really noticed her, it wasn't attraction. It was the way she stood alone after a board meeting while 2 investors walked past her like she wasn't there. I was heading to my car that Tuesday evening when I heard one of them say, not even quietly, "She's good, but we need someone younger to drive this next phase." Fresh energy. Investors like that. The other man laughed. She had her run. They kept walking. Susan stayed still for a second. Just a second. Then she bent to pick up her folder like she hadn't heard a thing. But I saw her jaw tighten. I saw the way she inhaled, slow and careful. Something about that stayed with me. 2 days later it happened again, but worse. We were in a conference room on the 22nd floor. Glass walls. City skyline behind us. She had just finished presenting a growth plan that was clean, clear, and realistic. I'd helped build part of the operations model. It was solid. One of the newer board members, a guy in his early 30s with expensive sneakers, leaned back and said, "This feels safe. Maybe too safe. No offense, Susan, but the market's moving fast. We need aggressive vision, not stability." He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked at the other men in the room. No offense. I felt something twist in my stomach. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't snap. She just nodded once and said, "Aggressive without foundation is just expensive chaos." It should have ended there. It didn't. He smirked. "Sure. I just think maybe the company needs a different kind of energy at the top." Different kind of energy. I watched the room. No one said anything. Not the CFO. Not legal. Just silence. The kind that agrees without speaking. I don't know what pushed me. Maybe it was the look on her face. Not anger. Not even embarrassment. Just something tired. Like she'd heard this before. I cleared my throat. It was small, that sound, but it felt loud in that room. "With respect," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "The last 2 quarters exceeded projections because of the systems she put in place. Safe doesn't usually produce that kind of margin." The room shifted. Heads turned toward me. The board member raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Daniel Harper. Operations." He gave a short nod, dismissive. "Right. Operations people love safe." A few quiet laughs. I should have stopped there. That would have been easier. Instead I said, "Operations people also clean up after aggressive ideas fail." The silence after that was different. Tighter. Susan didn't look at me right away. When she did, her expression was unreadable. The meeting moved on. Numbers. Charts. Action items. But something had shifted. Afterward I went back to my desk and immediately wondered if I had just damaged my career. An hour later, as I was packing up to leave, my phone buzzed. It was an internal message from Susan. "Do you have a minute?" My heart kicked in a way it hadn't in a long time. Her office was quieter than the rest of the floor. Lights dimmed. City glowing behind the glass. She had taken off her blazer. Sleeves rolled to her elbows. More human that way. She closed the door behind me. "You didn't have to do that," she said. I shrugged. It was accurate. A small smile touched her mouth. Not big. Just enough. "They weren't wrong," she said after a second. "The market does like younger." "That doesn't mean they're right," I replied. She studied me for a moment. Not like a boss assessing an employee. More like she was trying to place something. "Why speak up?" she asked. "Most people stay quiet." I didn't have a polished answer. "I don't like watching people get dismissed for the wrong reasons." She nodded slowly. "Still," she said softer now, "thank you." There was something in her voice that caught me off guard. Not gratitude exactly. Relief, maybe. I noticed then how tired she looked up close. A faint line between her brows. The weight of being the only woman at the table. The only one who had to prove she still belonged. She glanced at the framed photo on her desk. Her husband, I assumed. They were at some event. Smiling. Formal. "You know," she said quietly, almost to herself. "They never question the men about energy." I didn't know what to say to that. She straightened a stack of papers that didn't need straightening. A small, controlled movement. "I won't forget what you said in there," she added. "That matters." I left her office feeling unsettled. Not because I regretted it. Because something had shifted inside me. For the first time in a long while, my day hadn't felt like repetition. It felt like I'd chosen something. Like I'd stepped out of the quiet outline I'd been living in. That night, alone in my apartment, I kept replaying the look on her face when she thought no one was watching. The tight jaw in the parking garage. The way she held herself together in that conference room. I told myself it was professional respect. Nothing more. But when my phone buzzed again close to midnight with a short message from her, just 2 words. "Are you awake?" I stared at the screen longer than I should have. And I answered. That was the first boundary I crossed. 2 weeks later, meeting her for coffee felt normal. That was the first sign things were shifting. At first it stayed clean. Structured. She would text about work, ask what I was seeing from my side. Sometimes she would ask my opinion before a board call. I told myself that was professional trust. That was all. By early October, we had a rhythm. Coffee once or twice a week before the office filled up. A late walk around the block after a long meeting. Messages in the evening that started about operations and ended somewhere else entirely. It wasn't flirting. Not at first. It was something quieter. One night she admitted she had stayed in the office longer than she needed to because she didn't want to go home yet. She didn't explain why. I didn't push. I just said I understood staying somewhere because it felt easier than walking into something heavy. She replied that I seemed to understand more than most people. That line stayed with me. A month after that first coffee, she asked if I wanted to grab a drink after a brutal day of investor calls. She said it casually, like it was a continuation of work. We went to a small bar near the harbor. Dim lights. Quiet enough to talk without leaning in too close. She ordered red wine. I stuck with whiskey. We sat across from each other at first, a small round table between us like a boundary we both respected. She talked about pressure. About how every decision she made was measured not just in numbers, but in perception. She said she was tired of being described as composed. As if that was the only acceptable way for her to exist. I told her that being steady didn't mean being weak. I said it without thinking, and then realized I was talking about myself too. She smiled at that. At some point, she asked why I stayed late so often. I shrugged and told her the truth. It was easier than going home to silence. The office had noise. Movement. Even frustration felt better than emptiness. She didn't pity me. She just said that loneliness can get loud if you let it. We sat with that for a while. The physical distance between us started shrinking in small ways. Not dramatic. Just natural. When she leaned forward to make a point, our knees brushed under the table. Neither of us pulled away immediately. When we left the bar, it was colder than expected. She didn't bring a heavier coat. Without thinking, I draped mine over her shoulders for the short walk to her car. Her hand touched my wrist as she adjusted it. It was quick. Practical. But it lingered a second too long. By November, people had started noticing we were often in the same place at the same time. Nothing inappropriate. Just visible. We were careful at work. Doors open. Meetings documented. Conversations about projects. But there was a current under it now. Something that hummed when we stood too close in the hallway. The work crisis hit right before Thanksgiving. One of our biggest clients threatened to pull out over a systems failure that had been brewing for months before Susan arrived. It wasn't technically her fault, but she would carry the blame. We were in the office until almost midnight 3 nights in a row. Conference rooms covered in printouts. Whiteboards filled with timelines and numbers. I watched her in those hours. She didn't panic. She didn't bark orders. She moved quietly, asking precise questions, trusting the right people. When someone snapped at her from stress, she didn't snap back. Around 11 on the second night, the rest of the team went home to sleep in shifts. It was just the two of us left in the large conference room. She kicked off her heels and rubbed the back of her neck. Her hair had slipped loose. The sharp CEO image softened into something more human. I handed her a bottle of water and told her the revised plan would hold. I walked her through the numbers again calmly. She listened, then looked at me in a way that felt different. She said she didn't know what she would have done without me. I told her she would have figured it out. She always did. She shook her head slightly and said that having someone steady beside her made it easier to breathe. That word again. Steady. We worked side by side for another hour. At some point our chairs ended up close enough that our arms touched when we reached for the same page. Neither of us moved away. The crisis resolved by the end of the week. The client stayed. The board congratulated her publicly. No one mentioned the nights we spent rebuilding everything from scratch. The Monday after, she called me into her office with the door open, glass walls clear. She formally acknowledged my role in stabilizing the account. She said it in front of the senior team. It was professional. Earned. But later that evening, when most people had left, she stopped by my desk. She said she had made a decision. Her voice was steady, but there was something under it. She told me her marriage had been strained for years. That she and her husband had been living parallel lives under the same roof. That the boardroom comments about energy were not the only place she felt replaced. She didn't blame him. She didn't give me details. She just said she had asked for space. I didn't celebrate. I didn't lean in. I told her I was sorry she was going through that. I meant it. She looked at me carefully, and said she didn't want to blur lines. She said she respected me too much for that. She said whatever was happening between us needed to be handled with care. I agreed. But by December, care was getting harder. We started meeting on Sundays. Neutral spaces. A bookstore cafe in Cambridge. A quiet park by the river. Long walks where we talked about things that had nothing to do with quarterly results. She told me about being 30 and ambitious, about the first time someone suggested she tone herself down to be more likable. She told me how she built herself into someone untouchable because it felt safer than being dismissed. I told her about the first night in my empty apartment after my ex moved out. How I sat on the floor with a box of dishes and realized I didn't know who I was without being someone's husband. We didn't rush anything. But the tension grew in ordinary ways. Sitting on her couch one evening after a work dinner, talking about a book she recommended. Our shoulders touched. Stayed touching. She reached for my hand once, absent-mindedly, while making a point. When she realized what she'd done, she didn't pull away. She just looked at our hands, then at me. Her wedding ring caught the light. That was the obstacle, clear and heavy. She noticed me looking and slowly slipped her hand back, resting it in her lap. We didn't speak about it directly that night. Instead, she said she had filed for separation. It was recent. Painful. Necessary. I didn't move closer. I didn't move away. I told her that mattered. That she needed to close one chapter before opening another. She nodded. By January, the separation was public within her circle. Papers filed. Lawyers involved. It wasn't gossip at work yet, but it would be. And still, every time we said goodbye, it lingered longer. One snowy night, after another late meeting, I walked her to her car again. The street was quiet. Snow catching in her hair. She turned to thank me for the evening. I don't know who moved first. Maybe either of us. Maybe we just stopped pretending there was space left between us. Her hand came up to my chest, lightly. My hand settled at her waist. We didn't kiss. Not that night. But the air between us changed. I drove home with my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. And I knew, in that slow, undeniable way, that we were past friendship. We were standing at the edge of something that would cost us. The only question was whether we were willing to step forward. The first time I kissed her, it felt less like a decision and more like the end of pretending. It was late January. The kind of Boston cold that makes the air sharp in your lungs. We had stayed in the office too long again, reviewing a restructuring plan that would upset half the company. By the time we left, the building was almost empty. I walked her to her car like I had started doing without thinking about it. Snow from earlier in the week had turned to dirty slush along the curb. The city was quiet in that strange way it gets after 9, when the work crowd disappears but the night crowd hasn't fully arrived. She stopped beside her car but didn't unlock it right away. She said she had finalized the separation paperwork that afternoon. It was official now. No more gray area. No more half-married explanations. She didn't sound triumphant. Just tired. I told her that must have been hard. She nodded. Then she said something that stayed with me. She said she had spent years being strong in public, but in private she had been shrinking. She said she didn't want to shrink anymore. The streetlight above us cast this pale glow across her face. I could see the line between her brows again, the one that showed up when she was thinking too much. She looked at me and asked, quietly, what we were doing. I could have said we were friends. That would have been safe. Professional. Clean. Instead, I told her I thought about her constantly. I told her that I tried to frame it as respect, as partnership, as admiration. But it wasn't just that anymore. My voice didn't shake, but my chest felt tight. She didn't interrupt. I said I knew the risks. The board. HR. The gossip. I knew how it would look. I knew people would assume I was climbing something. Or that she was reckless. Then I told her the part one had been trying not to say out loud. I said I was in love with her. It sounded simple in the cold air. Not dramatic. Just true. There was a long pause after that. Long enough that I almost took it back in my head. She stepped closer instead. She said she had been fighting the same words for weeks. That she kept telling herself it was timing. Or stress. Or loneliness. But none of that explained why she felt calmer when I walked into a room. She said she was in love with me too. Hearing it didn't feel explosive. It felt steady. Like something sliding into place. She reminded me, gently, that this could change everything. My career. Her credibility. The company's trust. I told her I knew. She asked if I was sure. Not in a testing way. In a protective way. I said yes. And then she kissed me. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was slow, careful, like we both understood we were crossing into something that couldn't be undone. Her hands came up to my collar, fingers cold from the air. Mine rested at her waist, feeling the slight tremor she tried to hide. When we pulled back, she let out a breath that almost sounded like relief. We didn't say anything else for a moment. The city moved around us, indifferent. That night, she didn't drive home right away. She looked at me and asked if I wanted to come up to her place. Her voice was steady, but there was vulnerability under it. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to. Because I knew once we stepped into that space, it would be real in a different way. She saw the hesitation and said we didn't have to rush anything. We could just sit. Talk. I nodded. Her condo overlooked the harbor. Minimal, clean lines. Soft lighting. It felt like a place built for someone who didn't have time to linger. We sat on her couch at first, a careful distance between us. She poured 2 glasses of wine but barely touched hers. We talked about the board meeting scheduled for the following week. About how we would handle disclosure. About changing reporting lines if we moved forward. It sounded almost absurd, discussing HR protocol while our knees were inches apart. Eventually the conversation thinned. She looked at me in that direct way she had, and this time there was no glass wall, no conference table. When she reached for my hand, she didn't pull back. The second kiss was softer. Slower. It carried all the weeks of restraint we had built up. I remember the warmth of her skin under my hands. The way she exhaled against my neck like she had been holding something in for too long. We didn't rush to the bedroom like some reckless story. We stayed on that couch for a while, learning the shape of each other carefully. Hands exploring with patience, not urgency. The kind of closeness that grows out of trust, not impulse. When we finally stood, it felt like we were choosing each step. In her bedroom, the city lights filtered through sheer curtains. She paused near the edge of the bed and searched my face, as if making sure I was still certain. I told her I was. There was tenderness in the way we undressed each other. No bravado. No performance. Just 2 people who had been lonely in different ways, finally allowing themselves to be wanted. When she lay beside me, her head resting against my chest, I felt something I hadn't in years. Not excitement. Not conquest. Safety. Her hand moved slowly over my chest, then settled there, like she was grounding herself. Later, when we were tangled in warm sheets and quiet breath, she said she hadn't felt this scene in a long time. I told her she didn't have to be strong with me. We lay there for a long time without speaking. The city humming faintly beyond the windows. Before I left in the early hours, we talked about the practical side. We agreed we would tell HR. We would adjust my reporting line to the COO. We would do it by the book. She said she didn't want our relationship to be a secret. I told her neither did I. At the door, she kissed me again, softer this time, almost thoughtful. Driving home through empty streets, I knew things would get complicated. I knew people would talk. But for the first time in years, the thought of risk didn't scare me. It felt worth it. We told HR on a Tuesday morning. It felt strange to schedule a meeting about something that, only a week earlier, had been a secret held in the dark between us. Susan insisted we handle it properly. No whispers. No surprises. She said if we were going to do this, we would do it clean. I respected that about her. I always had. We sat side by side in a small internal conference room, glass walls, neutral carpet, a framed company mission statement that suddenly felt ironic. The head of HR listened carefully while Susan explained that we had entered into a personal relationship. She made it clear the separation from her husband had been finalized before anything physical happened between us. She was precise about that timeline. I stated that I understood the conflict of interest concerns. I offered to shift reporting lines immediately. HR was calm. Professional. They said the policy allowed relationships as long as direct reporting structures were changed and transparency was maintained. They also warned us, gently, that perception would be harder to manage than paperwork. We both nodded. By the end of the week, I officially reported to the COO instead of Susan. On paper, it was solved. In reality, it was just beginning. The whispers started quietly. A few longer looks in the hallway. Conversations that stopped when I approached. Someone joked in the break room about how operations must be very close to leadership these days. It was said lightly, but it carried weight. I pretended not to notice. Susan carried herself exactly as she always had. Focused. Measured. She did not soften in meetings. If anything, she became sharper. She overprepared. She refused to give anyone room to suggest she was distracted. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after we disclosed, I found an anonymous email in my inbox. It said I must have found an interesting way to accelerate my career. No signature. No accusation directly stated. Just implication. I deleted it and tried to move on. But it stayed with me. That night, at her condo, I told her about it. She went very still when I mentioned it. Then she asked if there had been more. I said no. Just that one. She exhaled slowly and said this was exactly what she feared. She said she didn't want my name attached to her in a way that diminished my work. I told her my work stood on its own. She looked at me like she wanted to believe that, but wasn't sure the world would allow it. The board meeting in February was tense. One of the older members asked pointed questions about governance. He didn't say our names. He didn't have to. Susan responded calmly. She explained the reporting shift. She emphasized that performance metrics remained objective. Afterward, in the hallway, I overheard someone say she had lost focus. It burned in a way I didn't expect. For the first time, doubt crept in. That night, I told her maybe we should take a step back. Not break up. Just reduce visibility. Protect the company. Protect her. She looked at me for a long time before speaking. She said she had spent her entire career adjusting herself to make other people comfortable. Lowering her voice. Softening her language. Taking credit quietly. She said she would not shrink her personal life to make room for gossip. Then she said something that cut through my hesitation. She said we were not doing anything wrong. I knew that. Logically. But logic doesn't quiet fear. A week later, the real test came. The same major client from the fall announced a surprise audit of our systems. If we failed, it would cost us millions and likely cost Susan her position. I could feel eyes on me as soon as the email came through. If I succeeded in stabilizing it again, people would say it was because I was favored. If I failed, they would say she was distracted. There was no neutral outcome. I buried myself in the work. Late nights. Cross-team coordination. Calls with vendors at odd hours. I kept documentation meticulous. Every decision logged. Every approval copied to the right channels. Susan stayed professional in public, even with me. In meetings, she addressed me by title, not by name. She challenged my assumptions in front of others the way she always had. She refused to treat me gently. I was grateful for that. The audit week was exhausting. On the final day, after presenting our findings and corrective measures, the client signed off. Not just satisfied, but impressed. They expanded their contract instead of pulling back. The announcement came through company-wide the next morning. It named the operations team specifically. It named me. Not because of her. Because the numbers were there. People congratulated me in the hallway. Some of the same people who had been whispering. The anonymous emails stopped. It wasn't a dramatic shift. No one apologized. No one admitted they had doubted us. But the tone changed. Susan and I didn't celebrate publicly. That evening, we ordered takeout and ate on her kitchen counter in silence for a few minutes, just letting the tension drain. She reached across the counter and squeezed my hand. She said she was proud of me. Not in a romantic way. In a way that acknowledged I had stood on my own. The pushback hadn't disappeared completely. It probably never would. But it had lost its sharpest edge. We had faced something together and come out stronger. And somewhere in the middle of all that stress, something else shifted too. A few weeks later, she stood in her bathroom holding a small white test in her hand, staring at it like it was a foreign object. When she walked into the bedroom and showed it to me, her face wasn't panicked. It was stunned. 2 faint lines. I felt the room tilt slightly. We had been careful. Or at least we thought we had. She sat down on the edge of the bed and let out a slow breath. She said this changed everything. I sat beside her, my mind racing through careers, board reactions, headlines, family. Then I looked at her. Under all of it, there was something else in her eyes. Not fear. Possibility. And for the first time since the whispers began, the question wasn't whether we could survive gossip. It was whether we were ready to build something permanent. When she told me she was pregnant, the room felt very quiet. Not dramatic. Not chaotic. Just still. Part of me expected panic to hit first. Or fear. Instead, what I felt was a strange, steady awareness that this was real life moving forward without asking permission. Susan sat on the edge of the bed, the test resting on the nightstand like it might disappear if we ignored it. She said she didn't think she could do this halfway. Not at her age. Not with her position. If we were going to bring a child into the world, it had to be anchored in something solid. I understood what she was saying. We had been building slowly, carefully, but this pushed everything forward at once. The next few days were quiet and practical. She scheduled a doctor's appointment. I rearranged meetings so I could go with her. We didn't announce anything. We didn't celebrate yet. We just moved step by step. At the clinic, sitting beside her in that small waiting room, I felt the weight of it more clearly. Not just responsibility. Partnership. She reached for my hand while we waited. Not for romance. For steadiness. After the appointment confirmed it, she looked at me differently. Less guarded. Like a door had opened that she couldn't close again even if she tried. That weekend, we sat at her dining table with papers spread out in front of us. Not financial reports this time. Legal forms. She said she didn't want a complicated life for this child. She had spent enough years navigating perception. She didn't want secrecy. She didn't want half measures. I told her I agreed. The board would find out eventually. The company would adjust. But what mattered more was what we were building privately. She asked me, calmly, if I was ready for this. Not just fatherhood. Commitment. I didn't answer quickly. I thought about my empty apartment. The silence that used to press against me at night. The version of myself that had been drifting since my divorce. Then I thought about her. The way she had fought to stay visible in rooms that tried to dim her. The way she softened when she felt safe. I told her I didn't want to stand on the edge anymore. She smiled at that, small and certain. 2 weeks later, I moved out of my apartment. It wasn't dramatic. No long goodbye. Just boxes in my car and keys left on the counter. Living together didn't feel chaotic the way I expected. It felt surprisingly normal. Mornings became shared coffee in the kitchen before work. Evenings became quiet dinners, sometimes takeout eaten straight from containers when neither of us had energy left. She left sticky notes on the fridge with reminders for her own meetings. I started adding mine next to hers. Our schedules blended. At work, we kept things disciplined. Professional distance in public. Clear reporting lines. But privately, we were building something steady. The pregnancy made her more reflective. She talked about aging differently now. Not as something to fight, but something to respect. She said she had spent years proving she still belonged in rooms built for younger men. Now she cared more about building a home where no one had to prove anything. Around the end of the first trimester, I did something I hadn't planned. We were sitting on the couch one evening, her feet resting on my lap. She was tired, one hand absent-mindedly resting against her stomach. I had been thinking about it for days. The timing. The symbolism. All of it. Finally, I stood up and walked to the small drawer in the hallway where I had hidden a ring. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't a spectacle. Just simple. Solid. When I came back into the living room, she looked up, confused at first. I told her I knew this wasn't traditional timing. I knew some people would say we were rushing because of the baby. I said maybe we were accelerating, but not because we had to. Because we wanted to. I told her I wanted to build a life with her that didn't hide behind caution. Then I asked her to marry me. There were no fireworks. No grand speech. Just quiet certainty. She covered her mouth with her hand for a second, not to be dramatic, just to steady herself. Then she said yes. Not loudly. Just firmly. When I slipped the ring onto her finger, it felt less like a milestone and more like alignment. Like we were finally saying out loud what we had already been living. The company found out about the pregnancy soon after. It spread faster than any policy memo ever could. There were looks. Comments about timing. Assumptions. But there was also something else. People saw that we weren't hiding. That we were still showing up. Still performing. Still leading. Susan didn't step back from her role. She adjusted her schedule, yes, but she didn't shrink. If anything, she grew more focused. She delegated smarter. She trusted her team. I kept delivering results. Quietly. Consistently. By spring, the noise had softened again. At home, our lives had changed in small, beautiful ways. We talked about paint colors for a nursery. We argued lightly about baby names. We fell asleep earlier than we used to, her head on my shoulder, my hand resting protectively over her stomach. One night, as we lay there in the dark, she told me she used to think her best years were behind her. That society had a way of convincing women that success had an expiration date. She said she didn't believe that anymore. I told her I didn't either. Commitment, I realized, wasn't a single moment. It was 1,000 small choices. Showing up. Staying steady. Choosing not to run when things got loud. And we were choosing each other. Not because it was easy. Because it was worth it. We didn't plan a grand wedding. Neither of us had the energy for spectacle, and honestly, we didn't want it. By the time summer arrived, Susan was 5 months pregnant. Her dresses fit differently now. Softer lines. She moved a little slower, but she still walked into boardrooms like she owned them. We chose a small ceremony on the rooftop terrace of her building overlooking the harbor. Just family and a handful of close friends. No press. No company-wide announcement. No curated narrative. The night before, I stood alone on that terrace for a few minutes, looking out at the water. I thought about the man I had been a year earlier. Divorced. Quiet. Going home to an apartment that echoed. I almost didn't recognize him. The morning of the wedding was calm. No chaos. No frantic rushing. Susan got ready in the bedroom with her sister. I waited in the living room, adjusting a tie I'd worn 100 times before but that suddenly felt too tight. When she stepped out, the room shifted. She wasn't trying to look younger. She wasn't trying to hide her pregnancy. The dress curved naturally over her stomach. She looked strong. Grounded. There was a confidence in her that didn't feel performative anymore. The ceremony itself was simple. We stood under a small arch of white flowers. The harbor wind carried a bit of salt in the air. A close friend officiated. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't deliver a polished speech. I told her that she had taught me that steadiness was not boring. That showing up consistently was not weakness. That love could grow quietly and still be powerful. She said I had reminded her she didn't need to shrink to be loved. That she didn't have to choose between ambition and softness. There were no dramatic pauses. No tears designed for photographs. Just two people speaking plainly. When we exchanged rings, I felt that same quiet alignment I had felt the night I proposed. After the ceremony, we stayed on the terrace eating simple food, laughing in small groups. Her board chair attended. So did the CO. A few colleagues came and treated us like what we were, two adults who had chosen each other. Not everyone approved. I knew that. But no one could deny that we were still delivering results. The company had grown that quarter. The audit success still carried weight. The numbers were stronger than before. In the months leading up to the wedding, some of the people who had whispered stopped whispering. Not because they suddenly loved us, but because it became clear this wasn't a scandal. It was a relationship. At one point during the reception, I noticed the younger board member who had questioned her energy, standing near the railing, watching the harbor. He approached us later, offered congratulations, and said he respected the way she handled the year. It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough. Later that night, after everyone left, Susan and I stood alone on the terrace. The lights of the city flickered across the water. She rested one hand on her stomach, the other in mine. She said she used to think love was something you did early in life. Something intense and reckless. She said she didn't expect to find it again in the middle of a career battle. I told her I didn't expect to find it at all. We had defied more than gossip. We had defied the quiet belief that certain chapters close forever. That a divorced man in his late 30s should settle for comfort. That a woman in her mid-40s should fade quietly to make space for younger voices. We didn't shout about it. We didn't turn it into a message. We just stood there, married, steady, waiting for the next chapter to arrive. A few months later, our son was born on a gray October morning. When I held him for the first time, I looked over at Susan in that hospital bed. Tired. Radiant. Still strong. And I realized the victory wasn't in proving anyone wrong. It was in choosing each other anyway. Our son is almost a year old now. Sometimes I wake up before the alarm and just lie there, listening to the small sounds in the apartment. The soft hum of the baby monitor. Susan moving quietly in the kitchen. The kind of ordinary noise I used to miss without admitting it. If you had told me 2 years ago that this would be my life, I wouldn't have believed you. Back then I thought my story had narrowed. Divorce felt like a closing door. I told myself I was fine. I had a job. A routine. Stability. But stability without connection is just structure. It doesn't keep you warm. Meeting Susan didn't fix me overnight. It didn't erase the loneliness. What it did was force me to step out of silence. The day I spoke up for her in that conference room, I wasn't trying to start a love story. I was just tired of watching someone be dismissed. That small act of courage changed everything. I've thought about that a lot. How easy it would have been to stay quiet. How comfortable it is to avoid risk. How often we tell ourselves it's safer not to get involved. But comfort has a cost too. Susan once told me she spent years shrinking parts of herself so people wouldn't feel threatened. I spent years shrinking too, in a different way. I confused being steady with being invisible. What I learned is that steadiness isn't small. It's powerful. It's the thing that holds when everything else shakes. We faced judgment. We faced assumptions. Some people reduced our relationship to gossip. Others questioned motives. For a while, it felt like we were under a microscope. But none of that mattered when we came home at night and chose each other again. Age became irrelevant inside our living room. Titles didn't matter when we were arguing gently about who forgot to buy diapers. The boardroom opinions faded when our son wrapped his hand around my finger. Second chances are real. They don't arrive with music or perfect timing. They show up in quiet moments. A message asking if you're awake. A cup of coffee before work. A hand resting on your chest in the dark. Love, at this stage of life, isn't reckless. It's deliberate. It's looking at the risks and stepping forward anyway. If there's one thing I know now, it's this: your story doesn't end just because something breaks. Divorce didn't define me. Age didn't define her. Gossip didn't define us. We defined ourselves. All it took was one decision to speak up. One choice to answer a message. One honest confession in cold air. Everything after that was built the same way. Steadily. Together.